A.Gomelsky is a Canadian historian of Jewish Ukrainian descent and author and publicist, known for his in-depth work on 20th century Eastern European history. His scholarship focuses especially on Jewish-Ukrainian relations, the Shoah or Holocaust, Soviet intelligence operations, and political figures such as Simon Petlura and Stepan Bandera. Having lived in both Israel and Canada, he writes in Ukrainian, Russian, and English. A.Gomelsky also remains active in international discourse. His key areas of research and focus are, firstly, disinformation and intelligence operations. A.Gomelsky's research uncovers how Soviet and Russian secret services used disinformation to divide the Jewish and Ukrainian communities. He illustrates how anti-Semitic tropes and smears were strategically deployed to prevent cooperation between historically oppressed Jewish and Ukrainian groups. Secondly, Jewish-Ukrainian solidarity and division. He studies the complex intersections between these two communities, focusing on how state propaganda has obscured moments of mutual support in favor of divisive myth-making. And thirdly, historical reconciliation and moral complexity. Through his writing and public lectures, he encourages both communities to recognize their shared histories, mutual struggles, and the manipulations they have endured.
Today we will talk about disinformation. Exactly 21 years ago, a man wrote about the USSR's attempt to misinform the broader Western audience. A man known and remembered today by only a few specialists. That man was Herbert Romerstein, on the screen. He is director of the Office of Counter-Soviet Disinformation in the United States Information Agency. He is the author and a remarkable article titled "Divide and Conquer: The KGB Disinformation Campaign Against Ukrainians and Jews." Here's the title. To be frank, I learned about him fairly recently. I was shocked to discover that without having been familiar with his work, I had reached the same conclusions as Romerstein through my own path. So we are talking about the fact that to this day, the systematic and malicious interference of the Kremlin in the affairs of relations of the sovereign states has not ceased. Once it was done by the Russian Empire, then these methods were refined and used by the communist regime. And now, for almost a quarter of century, they have been actively employed by the Putin's empire, by fueling and distorting history with lies and insinuations. Russia makes any inter-ethnic understanding and normalization of international relations quite impossible. And let me quote Romerstein, especially his article. Communist hatred of the Jews was obvious when Soviet propagandists wrote, "We know from history that freedom of thought and a scientific view of the world have always been mercilessly suppressed by Judaism, but it was important to them to divide the Jews and Ukrainians in the West, who had joined together to expose the Soviet-Russian totalitarian regime." End quote. In order to create a false image of the USSR as a peaceful and humane state, in the 1930s, Soviet authorities organized propaganda tours to the USSR for Western intellectuals who became living fellow travelers of the Soviet Union. I will name just a few of these renowned figures: playwrights George Bernard Shaw, economists and founders of the London School of Economic and Political Science Sidney and Beatrice Webb, as well as the writers Henri Barbusse and Romain Rolland. Very revealing words of Bernard Shaw while he was departing from the USSR. Tomorrow, I leave this land of hope and return to our Western countries, the countries of despair. Simultaneously, pro-Soviet and blatantly misinformative publications were actively promoted in the West, such as those by Walter Durant and other journalists of his kind regarding the Holodomor. This tragic event, a vivid example of genocide and artificially engineering famine by the communists in the eastern part of Ukraine, formerly USSR, in 1932 to 1933. For an example, Durant wrote, I quote, "The excellent harvest about to be gathered shows that any report of famine in Russia today is an exaggeration or malignant propaganda," end quote. In the late 1930s, on the eve of World War II, Soviet propaganda accused the West of striving for global war and refusing to yield to the legitimate territorial demands of Nazi Germany. The victory of the Nazis, let me emphasize, a joint victory with the West, provided the USSR with the enormous opportunities for propaganda and agitation in the Western world. The USSR had already been actively infiltrating its agents and recruiting supporters in the West before 1945. But after May 8, 1945, it became much easier, convenient to do so. I would like to draw your attention to one of the most persistent Soviet-Russian manipulative myths, the so-called Great Patriotic War. To clarify this term, by the way, initiated by the Stalin, refers to the episode of the World War II from June 22, 1941 to May 9, 1945, the German-Soviet conflict. This was done to obscure the inconvenient fact that the USSR entered World War II in September 1939 as an aggressor and occupier, an ally of Nazi Germany. This bloody and dirty stain on the USSR's reputation has been whitewashed with tales of pseudo-anti-fascism. But facts are stubborn. When Nazi Germany was bombing British cities, the USSR was supplying Germany with the raw materials and resources. Thus, the claims by Russian propaganda that the West delayed the opening of the Second Front against Nazism while the USSR fought alone was entirely false. The truth is that the First Front against Hitler was opened in September 1939 by Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The Second Front was only reluctantly opened by the USSR nearly 2 years later, when Polish, British, French, Belgian, Dutch, and Finnish cities lay in ruins. Regarding the spread of the disinformation and the influence of the USSR in the West, hostile information activities, the testimony of Alexander Orlov, this man, at the US Senate hearings in September 1957 is of particular interest. His life deserves a separate lecture or even more, but I will briefly mention that Orlov was a Soviet intelligence officer, an illegal NKVD resident in France, Austria, and Italy from 1933 to 1937, the NKVD resident and advisor to the Republican government in Spain. Orlov also lived illegally in the US for 15 long years. Here's the cover page of the hearings, and I quote, "The fifth line of the intelligence work is the so-called misinformation. The Soviet government is not only interested in obtaining the best information it can from abroad, secret information about the activities of the foreign governments, but also to misinform, to mislead foreign governments. For that purpose, there was a special department which forged diplomatic documents, which were sold and peddled around the world, with the view, for instance, of arousing suspicion in Italy against Germany, in Italy against France, or something like that. And that was very successful at times. The Soviet Foreign Office was interested in influencing the policies of the foreign governments by pitting one part of a government, for instance in France, against the other. For that purpose, members of government had been bribed both. With influence attained by other means, they would also keep the intrigue within foreign governments alive. End quote. Now I will present another document from the digital archive of Soviet dissident Vladimir Bukovsky. The Bukovsky archive is an important resource for studying the subversive activities of the USSR, both in the West and globally. This is a memorandum from the KGB to the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It's original in Russian. According to this document, in 1957, Wilfred Burchett, a Western journalist accredited in the USSR, received a remarkably generous reward from the KGB, a one-time payment of 20,000 rubles and a monthly salary of 3,000 rubles. To put it in perspective, the average monthly salary in the USSR at that time was around 750 rubles. So it's easy to see just how well Burchett was compensated for his services. This document also corroborates the testimony of a former KGB officer who defected to the West. Yuri Krotkov, during a hearing of the US Senate Subcommittee on Internal Security in November 1969 for the KGB, and during the hearings, Krotkov claimed that Wilfred Burchett had been his agent while Krotkov worked for the KGB. In addition to Burchett, Krotkov's agent was the world-renowned playwright Jean-Paul Sartre. Back in 1969, the defector from the USSR was not believed, neither in relation to Burchett nor even more Sartre, unfortunately. But this KGB document, which we now have the opportunity to study and see, has cleared Krotkov of the stigma of being false witness and fantasist. Particular close attention should be given to the KGB activities aimed against Ukrainian nationalists and Jewish Zionists, including measures to prevent their interaction and cooperation in opposing the USSR. Here is the notice that Central Committee of Communist Party of Ukrainian SSR received regarding propagandistic operation carried out by the KGB against Yaroslav Stitsko, a Ukrainian political figure and first deputy leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists under Stepan Bandera. For 40 years, Stitsko led the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, ABN, and it was an organization that fought against Moscow imperialism. And this is translation of the document from archive that I'm talking about the Burchett. You can see in English. And this is about Stitsko. I will quote this very interesting document. Since 1966, the KGB of Ukraine has conducted a series of activities, as a result of which the leader of the OUN Stitsko was presented to broad Jewish circles as one of the main culprits for the participation of OUN members in genocidal operations carried out by the Nazis. To successfully promote these activities, we prepared a proclamation in Hebrew, Yiddish, and English on behalf of individuals of Jewish nationality living in Germany, outraged by the impunity of Stetsko, calling for revenge on Stetsko for the thousands of innocent victims of genocide. These proclamations were sent to the editorial services of Jewish publishing houses in the USA, England, France, Israel, and Germany. End quote. This is the pamphlet or proclamation, as you can see. As we can see, Soviet authorities organized and carried out a provocative operation to misinform the Jewish community. As a former citizen of the USSR, I would note that while KGB calligraphers were writing these texts in Hebrew and Yiddish, ordinary Soviet citizens faced real prison sentences just for studying these languages. All in line with George Orwell quote from his book Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. By the way, Soviet citizens could also face imprisonment in labor camps just for possessing Orwell's books, Animal Farm in 1984. I would like to point out specifically that Soviet press specialized in publishing caricatures of its political opponents. Here, for example, is an eloquent caricature of Yaroslav Stetsko from Soviet press. Let's take a closer look. On the left, we can see what is supposedly Stetsko in a Nazi uniform against the backdrop of a concentration camp and crematorium, with a swastika combined with the Ukrainian tribe above and dated 1941. On the right-hand side, it's dated 1977, allegedly the same Stetsko speaking from a podium in a strange attire, reading some kind of scroll. Above him is a Star of David and the Ukrainian trident. This is the mixture of absurdity, lies, distortion of facts, and false information. Let's break them point by point. Absurdity. The swastika is not the Nazi one. It's the original, Buddhist, meaning it's reversed, not left to right, but right to left. Stetsko attire, it's also some strange mixture of the US flag, Jewish ritual talit, and the Arab kifiyeh. Jewish scrolls, as we can see, are not read from top to bottom, but from right to left. Lies, Stetsko never wore a military uniform, especially the Nazi one, and he was not an anti-Semite. Distortion of facts. From 1941 to 1944, Stetsko himself was a prisoner in Nazi prisons and concentration camps. False information. The so-called biography of Stetsko, quoted in accompanying text, it's not seen pretty well, but trust me, it's from this so-called biography, is a fabrication created by the KGB. Next document is extremely revealing. And another paragraph from the same document is highly interesting for all my Canadian compatriots. I will quote. A proclamation was sent on behalf of Ukrainian nationalists calling for the independence of the Canadian province of Manitoba. One copy of this postcard with an attached forged handwritten letter, supposedly written by a Ukrainian nationalist living abroad, was sent to the office of Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. The aim of this operation was to provoke a negative reaction from the Canadian government towards Ukrainian separatism, and sow distrust among the main emigre communities in the country. End quote. All the above show that KGB also attempted to misinform the Canadian government, portraying citizens of Ukrainian descent as a separatist planning to destabilize the country. I should note that it was not merely rumor spreading, but a letter forged with the handwriting of a specific individual, an example of conspiracy theory tactics. And here is another interesting document that shows how the USSR conducted its disinformation campaigns in the West. This note from the KGB document dated December 1973. I would like to point out that quotation marks around the words author and publisher appears in original text in quotation marks. Let me find. Yeah. Author, it's Russian, but trust me, it's author. And so is that. Same story. So I quote, in order to incite hostility between Zionists and Ukrainian nationalists in the USA, a pamphlet titled Lest We Forget was published. End quote. I will pause here. In this top secret KGB document, the goal of the disinformation campaign is clearly and cynically outlined. But let me continue to quote. The pamphlet, based on the documentary evidence, exposes the involvement of members of the OUN in the mass extermination of civilians, including participation in anti-Semitic actions during World War II. The author, in quotation mark, and publisher, in quotation mark, of the pamphlet was one of the leaders of a progressive Ukrainian organization, the League of American Ukrainians, who had visited Ukraine in recent years and was able to legitimize having access to the materials used in the pamphlet. To popularize the pamphlet, the author, quotation mark, involved one of the progressive Jewish activists from New York as a co-publisher. A joint statement by progressive Ukrainian and Jewish organizations in the USA against OUN members as war criminals had a certain political impact. End quote. It's worth to mention that this disinformation pamphlet is still available for purchase on Amazon and many other online bookstores today, continuing to poison Jewish-Ukrainian relations with lies and disinformation. Soviet press and literature also were filled with various pamphlets against Zionists and Ukrainian nationalists. In one such pamphlet, the propaganda spread lies about Stepan Mudryk, codenamed Mechnik. He was the deputy commander of the Ukrainian insurgent army, prisoner of Nazi concentration camps. From 1951, he was the head of intelligence of the external units of the OUN, also head of the main council of the OUN, and vice president of the World Congress of Free Ukrainians. As the representative of the OUNB, he was a member of the ruling bodies of numerous emigre organizations. In the OUN, he carried out important functions. During the leadership of Yaroslav Stetsko and Vasil Alexeyev, he headed the organizational cadre section of the OUNB. So, Soviet public propaganda describing him as a Bandera supporter, a former Gestapo officer whose hands are stained with the blood of Soviet people. This is Stepan Mudryk, one of the leaders of the Ukrainian nationalists. To expose Soviet disinformation, I am using different techniques and approaches. Sometimes declassified KGB archives as an antidote to the propaganda. Here's the KGB document about Mudryk. In case Stepan Mudryk, I quote this declassified KGB file. Due to identified persecution by the punitive bodies of the occupiers, at the beginning of 1943, Mudryk was forced to leave the area of his operations and return to the Lviv region. After returning on November 21, 1943, he was arrested by Gestapo, then moved to the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he remained until he was liberated by the Americans in April 1945. Since this KGB document on Mudryk was classified as a secret and existed in a single copy, the propaganda publications became a kind of sieve for preparing and hanging ideological nonsense on the outstretched ears of Soviet readers, suggesting to them that Mudryk was not a victim of the Nazis, but a Gestapo officer. By the mid of 1980s, the Soviet disinformation campaign against the Ukrainian diaspora in North America and anti-Soviet Ukrainian organization had reached a new phase. A declassified SBU document from KGB archives, dated October 18, 1985, is telling in this regard. I'll quote, "All these materials prompted the US authorities to create a special investigative unit within the Department of Justice to identify and prosecute Nazi war criminals. I should clarify that by these materials, KGB referred to the reprinted brochure, Lest We Forget, authored by the American communist of Ukrainian origin Michael Hanusiak, as well as several propagandistic films produced in the USSR. This document also reveals that after the US and USSR's propaganda attack extended to Canada, as a result, the Canadian government was forced to create Jules Deschênes Commission to investigate the activities of former members of the Waffen-SS Division Galicia. I'll quote, "To this end, materials about the punitive activities of the SS Galicia Division were printed in the influential newspaper Toronto Star under headline, 'We Accuse,'" end quote. But the most crucial part of this secret KGB document was the statement about the real goal of the entire campaign. Quote, "This in turn dealt a serious blow to the attempts of the ruling circles to use the OUN abroad in hostile activities against the Soviet Union, forcing OUN members to divert efforts and material resources to their own defense." End quote. The text of the document speaks for itself. Through the use of the disinformation, the USSR forced the governments of the USA and Canada to spend taxpayer money on investigating obviously false accusations. At the same time, these accusations ignited ethnic tensions between Jews and Ukrainians and created a false perception that US and Canada are really harboring Nazi war criminals. It is important to note that the Deschênes Commission found no evidence to support this accusation and published its finding in a special report. Here is the title page of the recently declassified part of the report. One would think that the issue was closed once and for all, but no. Today, nearly 40 years later, Russians, agents of influence in the West, accuse the Deschênes Commission of negligence, bias, and concealing the truth, claiming that not all of the Commission documents were published, without specifying exactly which documents they refer to. Let me clarify. As of February 1st, 2024, all of the Deschênes Commission documents were being declassified and published, except for the personal data of individuals whose cases were reviewed. This is the Government Canada publication. And this is confirmation made by official statement from the Canadian government. I quote, "While additional information that is no longer sensitive due to passage of time can now be released. Some of the information still remain protected in accordance with the Access to the Information Act and the Privacy Act. End quote. In summary, the demands of those pseudo-truth seekers in regard to the Galician division are akin to the fraudsters demanding that banks publish the personal details of all their clients. The collapse of the USSR in 1990 and 1991 seemed to destroy both the KGB and Soviet state and its propaganda machine. But the rise to the power of the KGB officer Vladimir Putin in year 2000 showed that the Leninist-Stalinist world revolution project did not die, but merely slowed down at a critical moment in history, adapting to use other, more effective methods. Information about this can be found in the manuscript of the book Labyrinths of the KGB, written by Israeli-American intelligence officer, Tsarist Gulag prisoner, human rights activist, and according to Soviet press, USSR's enemy number one, Avraham Shifrin. The manuscript also mentioned that right after World War II, and even during the war, the USSR transported entirely warehouses of paper, typewriters, ink, pencils, and other office supplies from Germany, including, of course, stamps and documents for it. All of this was carefully stored in Moscow for future use. Shifrin personally witnessed such material being transported from Minsk, Vilnius, and Kaunas. The archives of the Gestapo and other Nazi institutions were thoroughly removed from the even small towns, not to mention the magistrate of Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, Russia. Shifrin's testimony on this was corroborated by the KGB officer Nikolai Khokhlov, who defected to the West in 1954. Lots of you know that I am currently working with the archive of Avraham Shifrin. While reviewing the materials, I came across a particularly fascinating find, a detailed handwritten flow chart outlining the structure of the KGB. It's lengthy and intricate document, and I strongly believe it was created by Nikolai Khokhlov himself, who collaborated with Shifrin for many years, and later passed it on to him. Notably, the chart includes references to the special Jewish and special Ukrainian divisions. Let me point it out. It's hard to see, but it's a huge document. But most striking, however, it is the inclusion of a disinformation division, remarkably fitting for the theme of this lecture. Wouldn't you agree? This is Avraham Shifrin with his book. I can repeat his gesture. It's this book. Of course, he has white hair, no glasses, but book the same. And now I want to touch on another important aspect of the agitation and propaganda used by the Russian Federation to influence the Western community. This was actively employed by the USSR, and now, continuing the tradition, it's used by Putin's Russia. I am referring to culture, art, and sport. Sports, actually. Recent movies commissioned and financed in the last decade by Russian state structures, such as 28 Panfilov Men, Sobibor, T-34, and Kalashnikov, which mythologize and mummify Stalin's approach to the history of World War II, are actively exported from Putin's Russia to the West. By the way, Kalashnikov. These photos from Avram Shifrin's archive bring back memories of my childhood, especially my school years. In the last 2 years of the Soviet high school, all students, boys and girls, were required to take a subject called basic military training. We had to learn how to march, but most important, we have to train to disassemble and reassemble AK-47, the Kalashnikov assault rifle, within a set time limit. Believe it or not, I still remember how to do it. At one point, I could even do it blindfolded. It's just one more and one of the many reminders that USSR was always oriented towards war, not peace. A new twist in Russia's propagandistic activities in the West is the documentary film by Russian director Anastasia Trofimova, Russians at War. From 2014 to 2020, Trofimov, a graduate of the Communication and Political Science programs at the University of Toronto, worked for the Russian propaganda channel Russia Today, RT. The film is an attempt by the director to humanize the aggressors from the Russian army. I emphasize, to humanize not Russians, but the occupiers. Some of the interviewers repeated the mantra, "We were just following orders," on camera. I would like to remind political scientist Trofimova and those advocating for her that the Nuremberg trials set a precedent where such a justification did not exempt defendants from the responsibility and, of course, punishment. At the same time, Trofimova, as a Canadian citizen and a political science graduate, should be aware that she personally violated Ukraine's state borders and, accordingly, the laws of that country. Notably, in defense of Trofimova, RT posted on its website this material on September 13, 2024. It states that the film was pulled from the Toronto Film Festival after protests by the Ukrainian diaspora. RT claimed these protests were anti-democratic and violent acts, which is entirely untrue, of course, as they were extremely peaceful and actually factual. Next interesting document. Russian interference in political processes in the West and the spread of disinformation have currently reached a critical point. I would like to draw your attention to this US Department of Justice press release dated September 4, 2024, regarding the disruption of covert operations sponsored by the Russian government aimed at harmful foreign influence. These operations targeted audiences in the United States and other countries. Specifically, it mentions the seizure of 32 internet domains used in foreign malign interference campaigns directed by the Russian government, commonly referred to as doppelganger, in violation of US laws. Russia and ties, including Social Design Agency, Structura, National Technology, and NAO Dialogue, operating under the supervision and control of the Russian presidential administration, use these domains to clandestinely disseminate Russian government propaganda. Their goals included reducing international support for Ukraine, promoting pro-Russian policies and interests, and influencing voters during elections in the US and other nations. The Russian government and its proxies have aggressively driven covert Kremlin efforts to spread false news and amplify disinformational targeting the American public. Russia seeks to pass off fabrication as publications by the free and open US press in this bland scheme. Let me quote this affidavit. An expanding network of more than 60 websites posing as legitimate news organization, utilizing deceptive social media accounts to amplify the content of the fake websites. The fake websites appear to be carefully designed to mimic the appearance of a real news website. The fake websites included embedded images and functional links to genuine sites. End quote. Back in 2014, I wrote that for over 100 years, the authorities of Tsarist, Communist, and Putin's Russia have used anti-Semitism as a tactic for spreading disinformation and propaganda. In January 2024, the US State Department reached a similar conclusion. In the report that you can see, the title "Over a Century of Anti-Semitism: How Successive Kremlin Regimes Have Used Anti-Semitism to Spread Disinformation and Propaganda," the State Department confirmed many of my earlier publications. For example, it highlights how, in the late 1930s, Stalin institutionalized anti-Semitism as official state policy of USSR. Until his death in 1953, the Soviet state security apparatus conducted anti-Semitic disinformation campaigns, such as the persecution of the ruthless cosmopolitans, the suppression of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and the infamous Doctor's Plot, all aimed at the portraying Soviet Jews as traitors. During the 1960s to 1980s, the KGB carried out several covert active measures to discredit perceived enemies such as the Catholic Church, West Germany, and the United States by branding them as anti-Semites. These efforts complemented operations targeting Zionists and Ukrainian nationalists. President Putin and the Kremlin exploit centuries-old anti-Jewish prejudices through their disinformation and propaganda apparatus, serving what they perceive as Russia's state interest. The current occupants of the Kremlin have consistently worked to discredit their perceived adversaries, weaken them, and sow division within their ranks by falsely accusing them of Nazism and anti-Semitism, spreading hostility, and propagating anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. In doing so, the Kremlin fuels anti-Semitism, which is intensifying globally now. Next, it's very interesting document that I received from the trenches in Ukraine. Captured modern Russian propagandistic materials, like a brochure titled Black Book, Atrocities of Banderites, and some pictures which blamed military personnel of the armed force of Ukraine as sadists, rapists, and cynical killers. Back in October 2024, Canada Parliamentary Committee on National Security and Defense held hearings regarding the influence of Russian disinformation on Canada's information landscape. These hearings gained significant attention because prominent conservative politician and former Minister of Citizenship and Immigration Chris Alexander accused well-known Ottawa citizen journalist, David Puleze, of working with the Soviet intelligence agencies and potentially continuing his collaboration with Russian operatives. As evidence, Mr. Alexander presented declassified KGB documents indicating that Puleza had been registered with Soviet intelligence since 1984 under the codename Stewart. According to Alexander, the authenticity of 8 KGB document copies he submitted was verified by 2 independent experts and several historians. The personnel file opened on David Puleza in August 1984 stated that he came to the KGB's attention as a person with potential future opportunities to work in prominent media outlets in Canada and the United States. The documents describe Puleza as holding left liberal views and being loyal to Soviet policies. A handler was instructed to cultivate a relationship with him. In addition to collecting general information and assessing his prospects, the KGB was tasked with verifying whether Puleza had connections with Canadian officials, journalists, activists, politicians, and business figures. Naturally, Puleza denies any association with the KGB or FSB. Fellow journalists and professional critics of imperialism, Canadian imperialism, immediately came to his defense. I should mention that it was precisely my effort to expose Soviet and Russian disinformation tactics and their systematic attempts to distort historical narratives that led to my name. Number 15. Yeah. 15. Had been added March last year to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs sanction list. This includes a personal travel ban preventing my entry into the Russian Federation. Today, in this room, I recognize a few fellow Canadians who share that distinction. May I kindly ask those of you who are also on this list to raise your hands, please. How we will survive without access to Lenin's mummy and Stalin's grave on the Red Square remains to be seen. It will be a truly heartbreaking loss. But I'm sure we definitely will find a way to cope. On a more serious note, I will tell that it's quite telling that these sanctions consistently target individuals who actively challenge Russia's manipulation of history and work to bring to light the truth about the nature and crimes of the Soviet regime. And to conclude, I would like to say that the facts presented today, along with the declassified documents and all gathered evidence, are intended to prevent modern Russia's destructive attempts to misinform the broader Western audience, distort world history, and influence Western policy. Those who oppose this distortion of the truth face pressure from the Russian officials and become targets of Putin's land defamatory propaganda. Russia's goal nowadays, much like the USSR before it, follows principles as old as time. Accuse your opponents on your own sins and divide and conquer. And this is exactly how Herbert Romerstein titled his great expose on Soviet disinformation campaigns on the West. Thank you very much.
My question is, when somebody tells one of our young people, well, all Ukrainians are Nazis, like Halichina, they had the uniforms. Give me 2 sentences that a 16-year-old can answer to that accusation.
The easy answer to that Nazi uniform is not equal to criminal status. Why? Because we have many righteous persons who saved Jews in the World War II and who wear the Nazi uniform. The most important of them and most famous is Oskar Schindler. He was the officer of Abwehr, of military intelligence service, let's say, of Nazi Germany. Same Abwehr that Admiral Canaris was headed. And Admiral Canaris, for many years, already nominated to be righteous person in the world, and Chabad nominating him for many years, sending requests to the Yad Vashem to pronounce him, to give the title the righteous person. So we can accuse person and just saying because you wear the uniform, you're the criminal. It's the easiest answer.
Thank you for your very tight analysis. Just wanted to take your mind about something that has a history of 40 years, going back to the mid-80s, if not earlier, concerning a Cleveland auto worker, John Demjanjuk. Of course, many of us had to live through that. Do you have any notes or any conclusions in that case?
Yeah. I'm always saying there is no coincidence, there is system. The Abraham Shifrin that I was talking about, he was expert on the defense of Demjanjuk in Israel. What he's proven that the documents provided to the court in Israel was forged. That's why he came to the podium, let's say, in a court with a pile of the documents, which I have now in the archive, and he said that Demjanjuk, yes, he was in the guard of the concentration camp, but he was not the person that he was aiming for, first of all. And second, the document that was provided was forged in Moscow by KGB and provided like authentic documents. And it's what happened. Thanks the Lord that Soviet Union fell apart and real documents had been found, and found that it's really so. It was different person, and most important, that Soviet knew about it. And about it, Herbert Romerstein also wrote an article that Soviets knew who it was, that it was not Demjanjuk at all. It was different person. Yes, he was in guard, but he was not the person who was blamed for. That's why. And Abraham Shifrin defended, and it was very tough time for him in Israel because he was blamed that he defended Nazis. And he said, did we found evidence? Because Abraham Shifrin by himself, he was a lawyer. He had diploma, but he didn't practice, of course, but he was a lawyer. And he said, if person not convinced, we can blame him. We can't blame or punish him for someone else.
I'd just like to make a comment, if I may, apropos what you said. I am a person who knew Shifrin, and I traveled with Shifrin through Canada. And I got to know him well. I think I spent about 2 weeks with him, flying around and talking with him. He was a marvelous human being, a marvelous human being. He very much liked and tried to help Yuri Shukevich, who was Roman Shukevich's son, who was blind and was being persecuted by the Soviet Union. And that was a favorite sort of his. I just wanted to mention that. And I also want to mention that in the 1970s, I was in New York as a representative of the World Congress of Free Ukrainians working at the United Nations. And at that time, from 1976 to 1978, I was also a member of what we called the Committee for the Defense of Soviet political prisoners. And Ukrainians and Jews worked together to help the dissidents in the Soviet Union. I myself met and spoke and worked with Ed Klein, who owned Klein department stores in the New York area, and a guy named Marvin Wolf, who was a Jewish human rights lawyer in New York. Those two in particular stood out, and also Ramsey Clark, who was the Attorney General of John Kennedy, former Attorney General of John Kennedy, who worked with our committee to try and help free Soviet dissidents, including Ukrainians and Jews, from the USSR. And I would also like to mention, and forgive me for taxing your time, I would just like to notice the curiosity that when things get bad in Eastern Europe, a prominent activity or action that Russian leaders take. For example, in 1956, when the Hungarian Revolution took place, the Suez Canal crisis erupted in the Middle East. In 1968, when they invaded Czechoslovakia, the Middle East again broke out in trouble. And nowadays you've got the Gaza uprising and the army, the war that's going on there at a time when there's a war going on in Ukraine. And I just would like to note the coincidence that these two events are taking place, and I believe there's a connection via Putin to the events. Although if you research it, you will not find solid documentation about the connection.
You can find.
Well, Hamas.
You can find in archive. Sorry to interrupt you, Andy. In Bukovsky archive, you can find many documents that giving you straight connection.
Okay.
Sorry.
Fine. Okay. I don't know about those, but I'm sure they're there. Okay. One sensitive thing I want to mention is for the questioner who said, well, you know, how do we answer the problem of Ukrainians who were in German uniforms? There is evidence that there were Jewish soldiers in the German army as well. I'm sure they weren't there because they were Nazis and they wanted to support Germany. So if there were Ukrainians in German uniforms, perhaps you might take a look at the fact that there were also German Jewish soldiers in German uniform. No doubt almost all of them, if not all of them, did not want to be in them.
I mentioned in archive of Vladimir Bukovsky, there is evidence that KGB supply so-called Palestinians. Actually, the Palestinian nation not exist because it was invented in KGB. It was Arabs in Palestinians before 1948 considering both, not just Arabs and Jews, but also Bedouins and other nations, because they live in Palestine, so-called Palestine. First of all, and second, you can find that in these documents that Soviet Union supplied with the training, with the military uniforms, with weapons, most important, these so-called Palestinians that fight because the only reason to fight and kill Jews and destroy the Israel. It was always enemy, and we have to remember that Soviet Union was always enemy of both Ukrainian and Jews.
But I wanted to thank you for pointing out those propaganda leaflets that show Ukrainian soldiers as horrible, gay, anti-family representatives, whereas the Russians are represented as the, sacred family unit. There was a conference that just took place in Moscow. As you know, Elon Musk's father attended, and a conspiracy journalist, Alex Jones, attended. It's financed by an oligarch by the name of Malofeyev, who specifically funds organizations that are supposedly pro-Christian, pro-family, and yet they attract all of the crazies and unfortunately several politicians from far-right parties that are also anti-Ukrainian and also promote all of these, you know, stereotypes that Ukrainians are anti-Semitic. So I really hope that when you expand your research, you will also include those links that exist to this very day, because everything you have shown is repeating itself now.
Absolutely.
And to the point that Andy made about the Middle East, when Litvinenko was poisoned, right before his poisoning, one of the interesting things that came out in the news was he had revealed that the Russians had trained al-Zawahiri, who was the right-hand man of bin Laden, and he revealed Moscow's hand in the horrible events of 9/11, and there were several European newspapers that published Litvinenko's interview. Unfortunately, the KGB murdered him. But again, he revealed Moscow's role in destabilizing the Western world and creating this conflict, both in the Middle East and in the US. So thank you for your work.
While working with archive of Shifrin, I found out very interesting things about Khokhlov that I just briefly mentioned. Khokhlov was twice poisoned by same polonium, but he was lucky, he was safe. And Khokhlov was also escapee from the Soviet Union, because what happened, he has to kill some Russian emigres and like anti-communist Russians in Paris and Berlin. But he refused to do so, and he escaped to the West. Interesting, quite enough, that he explained how it's happened, and he knows lots of techniques that Soviet Union used in KGB. And it's interesting because it's all related. Litvinenko was not the first one. And it's same story, same approach, same knowledge, and same tool. Yeah.
My wife and I were part of the Jewish part of the crowd, and so thank you for hosting us, and wonderful to hear the story. And I'm struck over the last number of days at the insanity of the Russians bombing apartment buildings, and the world stays silent, really. It's maybe a footprint in the newspapers. And I'm wondering what your thought is in respect of this world that is now completely upside down. You know, the attack on the Jews, the Ukrainians not getting the amount of publicity that the press should give it. And what are our politicians doing? And why are our politicians so ineffective? And why are they upside down and not standing up for what's right, and are being able to be completely influenced by all of this nonsense that's coming out of coming out of the Kremlin?
Okay, thank you. The short answer, it will be that probably those politicians and journalists, they missed, either they missed the history lessons, or they have, like Tucker Carlson, history teacher, Vladimir Putin. And he learned the history from the Putin, and he repeat. So he didn't know about the thing that I told now. And they don't understand how dangerous Soviet Union was and how dangerous KGB. Actually, this amazing flow chart that I found is huge. It's huge. It's 2 pages, and it's writing down very carefully. And it's very important stuff, how KGB has been structured, what they doing and how they doing. It's almost everything was under control, and they control everything in the Soviet Union and abroad as well, because they influence the whole world. Actually, we're talking about Black Panthers, yeah, in United States, 1973. In archive of Vladimir Bukovsky, we can have the proof that Soviet Union was managing them and influencing them and forcing them to fight. Another interesting point, I know maybe not every Jew support Mayor Kahane, but for quite interesting that in archive of Abraham Shifrin, I found letter from Slava Stitsko. She was the wife of Yaroslav Stitsko that I'm talking, and she was head of the ABN after his death, Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, which is part of the World Anti-Communist League, first of all. And second, it was a letter from the Slava Stitsko to Mayor Kahane, with asking to write the article for them. They were communicating. I found the documents that Shifrin was communicated with Ukrainian nationalists about Mayor Kahane. And most important, what he's saying, that USSR is enemy of Ukrainians and Jews. And there is lots of evidence that it's true. And I'm working toward to just unite two nations, that we will be together fighting the common enemy.
So, again, thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.